The CEO mocked the black waitress, dismissing her as nothing more than a server with no place in the corporate world. But when she casually pointed out a critical flaw in his company's contract, everything changed. With no degree and no formal experience, she wasn't supposed to know anything about business, yet she saw things his legal team missed. As her sharp mind and self-taught expertise turned the tables, the CEO was left questioning everything. What happens when a single mother defies the odds and a powerful CEO's ego? This is a story of resilience, betrayal, and power redefined. Becky Williams wiped her hands on her apron as she moved between tables, greeting regulars with a smile that she hoped hid the exhaustion gnawing at her. She had been up before the sun, picking up an early shift at the local cafe, and would be here until late, only to rush home to her 2 children. A single mother in her mid-30s, she had once dreamed of a life different from this one, a life that included a degree in finance, a stable career, and a home where her kids could thrive. But dreams were often fragile things, and Becky's had been shattered long ago. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly noon, and the cafe was filling up with a lunchtime rush. Her mind wandered back to those early days when she had first enrolled in college, when she had sat in lecture halls filled with young, hopeful students just like her. She had imagined herself walking across the stage at graduation, degree in hand, ready to take on the corporate world. But life had a way of interrupting plans. When her son, Elijah, was born, and her daughter, Maya, came just 2 years later, she was forced to drop out of school. The bills piled up faster than she could keep up, and she had to make a choice: education or survival. She chose survival, taking on multiple jobs, each one more demanding than the last, until she found herself waiting tables in a small, local cafe. The work was grueling, and the hours were long, but she never lost sight of the goal that still lived in her heart. One day, she would return to school. She would finish her degree, and she would build a better life for her children. A loud clang from the kitchen jolted her from her thoughts. She returned to the counter just as a new customer sat down at one of the corner booths. He looked familiar, but Becky couldn't quite place him. He was dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his face stern with a look of concentration. A briefcase sat beside him, and in front of him a pile of paperwork, some of it scribbled over in red ink. Becky's eyes narrowed as she approached. "Coffee?" she asked, forcing her tired smile onto her face. The man looked up, his sharp eyes scanning her briefly before nodding. "Yes, please. Black, no sugar." Becky poured the coffee, glancing at the papers on the table. The lines of red ink caught her eye. She was no expert, but the way the numbers and clauses were crossed out or circled seemed wrong. She had never been formally trained in business or finance, but during her years of self-study, she had picked up enough to know when something wasn't right. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity pushed her forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, trying to sound casual as she placed the coffee in front of him. "I couldn't help but notice there are some inconsistencies in that contract you're reviewing." He didn't look up at first, too engrossed in his paperwork. Then, with a faint chuckle, he finally met her gaze. "I'm not sure what you mean. This is a legal document. Nothing for someone like you to worry about. You are not smart enough to advise me." The words stung, but Becky had learned long ago not to take offense at things like that. She wasn't new to being underestimated. She was used to people dismissing her because of her appearance, her job, or the fact that she was a single mother. But she wasn't about to let that stop her from speaking up. "I may not have a law degree," Becky said, keeping her voice steady, "but I've been studying finance for years. I've taught myself the ins and outs of contracts and business practices." She pointed to a specific clause in the contract, one where a penalty was outlined, but the terms for mitigation were vague and contradictory. "This section right here, it could cost your company a lot more than you think if you don't address it. You've got 2 clauses that cancel each other out." David Whitmore's smile faded, and his eyebrows furrowed as he leaned over to examine the paper more closely. He shifted in his seat, clearly taken aback by her words. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "My legal team has reviewed this thoroughly." Becky continued, pointing to another part of the contract. Here, you've got conflicting language regarding termination rights. One section says you can terminate without cause after 30 days' notice, and another one says you need a valid reason. If you don't reconcile those, it could lead to an expensive legal battle if the other party decides to fight it. David looked at her with new interest, his gaze sharpening. He sat back in his chair, still not fully convinced, but now fully engaged. "You've clearly put some thought into this," he said slowly, the skepticism in his voice replaced by curiosity. "I've been studying this stuff for years," Becky replied. "I had to drop out of college to take care of my kids, but I never stopped learning. I've spent countless hours reading books, watching online courses, and even analyzing contracts. It's just something I've always been passionate about." David's eyes flickered with something Becky couldn't quite read. Surprise? Respect? He stared at her for a moment longer, as if seeing her for the first time. She had expected him to laugh or dismiss her again, but he didn't. Instead, he sat forward, his attention fully on her. "You really know your stuff," he said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "I'll admit, I didn't expect that from you." Becky felt a rush of heat in her chest, but she remained composed. "I'm just pointing out what I see," she said, shrugging slightly, though she could feel her pulse quicken. "I don't have a fancy degree or a suit like yours, but sometimes the simplest things are the easiest to miss." David smiled, though it wasn't the mocking smile from earlier. It was more of an acknowledgement, a recognition of her insight. "That's impressive, really impressive." He paused, as if weighing something in his mind, then made a decision. "I could use someone like you on my team. I'm the CEO of Whitmore Insurance, and we've been looking for a consultant to help us with contract analysis and business efficiency. You may not have formal credentials, but I think you've got something that money can't buy: intuition. How would you feel about coming in for a meeting? We could talk about bringing you on board." Becky's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected anything, really, except the usual dismissal. But here was this man, this CEO, offering her a chance. A real chance. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Take your time," David said, sensing her hesitation. "You don't have to decide right now, but I think you'd be an incredible asset to our team." Becky stood there, unsure of what to say. She wasn't sure whether she could accept such an offer. Could she really walk into that world with nothing more than her self-taught knowledge and her dreams? Was she ready to step out of the cafe and into something bigger? She looked down at her worn apron, her tired hands. Could this be her chance? She didn't know yet, but the thought lingered. Just for a moment, Becky allowed herself to entertain the possibility that maybe, just maybe, her life could be different. David noticed the hesitation in her eyes and gave a slight nod. "Don't rush, but think about it." Becky nodded back, her mind racing. For the first time in a long while, she felt something stir inside her that wasn't exhaustion or resignation. She felt hope. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there, and that was enough for her to hold on to. Becky sat at the small kitchen table in her cramped apartment, the din of the children playing in the living room barely reaching her ears. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of uncertainty and fear. The coffee had long since gone cold in her mug, but she hadn't noticed. Her mind kept drifting back to the encounter with David Whitmore earlier that day. What was he thinking? The CEO had offered her a chance to consult with his company, to work with a team of professionals who were experts in their fields. At first, it had sounded like a dream. A way out, a way up. But that wasn't how Becky operated. She didn't take handouts. She didn't want to be seen as a charity case. She didn't want David thinking she was using her circumstances to leverage his kindness. She had worked hard for everything she had. She had fought every day to keep her family afloat, to make sure her children had what they needed. Becky wasn't looking for pity, and she wasn't going to accept anything she hadn't earned. That was the principle she lived by. The offer gnawed at her. He had said she was an asset, a huge asset, but Becky couldn't shake the feeling that accepting his offer would be like admitting she had somehow failed on her own. It was a fear she wasn't used to feeling. She had always been the one to stand on her own 2 feet, to solve her own problems. The sound of Elijah's laughter filtered through, pulling her back to reality. She smiled softly, knowing that the only thing that mattered was providing for her children. They deserved the best, and that meant staying focused on the path she was already on. But what if there was more? What if this offer could be the break she'd been waiting for? She picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Carla, who had always been the one to talk her through moments like this. The phone rang twice before Carla picked up. Becky paused, then let out a long breath. I got this offer today, from a guy I met at the cafe. David Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Insurance. He wanted to help with his company. He says I have an eye for business, that I could be a consultant. Carla was silent for a moment, processing the information. That's amazing, Becky. Why are you hesitating? Becky leaned back in her chair, running her fingers over the worn edges of the table. I don't know, it feels like it's too much. I've never worked in a corporate setting. I've never had a degree, and I don't want him to think I'm taking advantage of him just because I'm struggling. I've always done things on my own. I don't want to be seen as someone who needs pity. Carla chuckled softly. That man saw you. He saw your skills, your potential. This isn't charity. You've earned this. You're not asking for a handout. You're offering something valuable. Becky's chest tightened. I don't know if I can do it, Carla. What if I fail? What if I get there and I don't belong? Becky, Carla said, her voice firm but kind, you've been proving your worth every single day. Look at what you've done for your kids. Look at what you've done for yourself. You're not some charity case. You're a force. And if David Whitmore sees that, why shouldn't you? Becky's heart skipped a beat. I don't know. I just don't want to be another person who doesn't live up to expectations. Sweetheart, you've got this, Carla said. You've always had this. You wouldn't have gotten this far if you didn't. Don't let fear hold you back from something that could change your life. The words hung in the air, and Becky let them sink in. She wasn't afraid of the work. She was afraid of the weight of the opportunity, of stepping into a world that felt so far removed from the cafe and the life she knew. But Carla was right. This could be her chance to change everything. For her kids. For herself. Becky took a deep breath. Thanks, Carla. I needed to hear that. No problem, Carla replied. Don't let this slip through your fingers. Becky hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of the decision was still there, but now there was something else, an ember of hope that had started to burn brighter. It wasn't going to be easy. She wasn't naive enough to think it would be. But this could be the turning point she had been waiting for. This could be the opportunity she had worked so hard for, without even knowing it was coming. She glanced at the clock, then stood up, feeling the weight of her decision settling over her. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door. David had said she could take her time, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just an offer. It was a chance. A chance to prove that she could make it in a world that had always made her feel small. Becky knew she couldn't let fear decide for her. She couldn't let pride stand in the way of something that might change her life. When she walked into the cafe the next morning, David was already seated in the same corner booth, his briefcase open in front of him. He looked up as she approached, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good morning, Becky," he said, his voice warm but professional. "Morning," Becky replied, standing there for a moment, her hands pressed tightly together. She swallowed hard, feeling the nerves rising up again. "I've thought about your offer," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I think I'm ready to give it a try. But I want you to know, I'm here to prove myself. I'm not looking for a handout. I'm looking for a chance to earn my place." David's smile widened, and he nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." Becky took a seat across from him, the first step into a new world. One she had earned, one she was finally ready to embrace. This wasn't charity. This was just the beginning. Becky stepped off the elevator on the 24th floor, her heart racing in her chest. She had been to the building once before, but only as a visitor. Now, this place, this corporate tower, felt overwhelmingly different. It was no longer a distant dream, but her reality, and the reality was intimidating. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and every person she passed seemed to have somewhere important to be, walking with a purpose that made Becky feel like she was trailing behind. She smoothed her jacket down, a small comfort against the anxiety rising in her throat. Today was her first official day at Whitmore Insurance. David had introduced her to the team the day before, his team of sharply dressed executives who had looked at her with polite curiosity. She had felt their stares on her like an invisible weight, wondering if they saw her as the outsider she feared she was. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, directed her to the conference room where the morning meeting was about to begin. Becky walked in, feeling all the eyes turned toward her as she entered. She quickly took a seat at the far end of the long, glass-topped table, her hands folded tightly in front of her. David was already there, discussing something with another executive, his voice confident and sure. When he saw Becky, he nodded and smiled, offering her a reassuring look. But Becky couldn't help but feel small, sitting in that room, surrounded by people who had been in this world for years, maybe decades. "All right, let's begin," David said, his voice commanding attention as he looked at the team assembled around the table. "Becky's here with us today. She's going to be taking a deep dive into our contracts and processes to identify areas where we can improve. Becky, why don't you start by walking us through your initial findings?" Becky nodded, forcing a smile as she stood. She was ready. She had spent the last week reviewing contracts, analyzing financial statements, and familiarizing herself with Whitmore Insurance's internal processes. Her self-taught knowledge had gotten her this far, and now it was time to prove it. "Thank you, David," she began, her voice steady but quieter than she'd like it to be. "I've reviewed some of the contracts, focusing particularly on the client agreements and their legal terms. One issue I noticed is that our standard contracts include clauses that seem outdated. There are discrepancies in the penalty fees for late payments, and some terms conflict with our billing structure. If these issues aren't addressed, they could create problems for us down the road." She paused for a moment, glancing around the table. There was silence, but no one interrupted her. She took that as a good sign. "Also looked at our internal reporting processes," Becky continued, gaining more confidence as she spoke. "In some cases, there seems to be a lack of integration between the legal and financial departments. There are redundant processes that could be streamlined to increase efficiency and reduce overhead. I'd recommend reviewing our software tools to make sure all departments are on the same page when it comes to financial reporting and legal documentation." Becky took a breath and finished. "These are just a few initial observations, but I believe addressing them could significantly improve both client relations and internal workflow." There was a moment of stunned silence. The room was still. Becky couldn't tell if they were impressed or just unsure about what to make of her. She sat back down, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. David was the first to break the silence. "Excellent work, Becky," he said, his tone warm but measured. "These are exactly the kinds of insights we were hoping to get from you. Let's schedule some follow-up meetings to go over these issues in more detail." The executives around the table exchanged looks, and some of them nodded, though Becky noticed a few skeptical glances. She wasn't naive enough to think everyone was on board just yet. But David had her back, and that was what mattered most. As the meeting went on, Becky continued to offer her insights, though she couldn't help but feel the tension building. Some of the higher-ups seemed to take her suggestions with a grain of salt, even as they nodded politely. One of the senior executives, a woman named Carol, raised an eyebrow as Becky pointed out inefficiencies in the billing system. "I'm sure you're right about the inefficiencies," Carol said, her voice dripping with a subtle edge of doubt. "But Becky, without a formal degree or years of experience in this field, how do we know that you're seeing the full picture? I mean, we got a team of experts for a reason." Becky's stomach tightened at the challenge in Carol's voice. She had been expecting this, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. Carol wasn't alone in her skepticism. Becky could sense the unspoken question in the room. Who was this woman, really? David glanced at Becky, a silent signal for her to respond. She met Carol's gaze, holding her ground. "I'm not here to replace the experts," Becky said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to offer a fresh perspective. Sometimes the people who've been in the trenches for years get too close to the problem to see the obvious solutions. I may not have a degree, but I've spent years learning about business and finance. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it. Just consider the results. I'm confident that my observations can make a difference. Becky could feel the eyes of the room on her, the silent judgment lingering in the air. But she didn't back down. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip away because of someone's doubt. David, sensing the shift in the room, spoke up. I've seen Becky's work firsthand, Carol. She's more than qualified to help us identify areas for improvement. Let's give her the chance to prove it. The room went quiet again, but this time, there was no immediate pushback. Slowly, one by one, the other executives nodded, acknowledging Becky's words. Some of them still looked skeptical, but none of them spoke out. After the meeting ended, David walked with Becky down the hall toward her new office, a small, private space just down from the executive suites. He placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support. "You did great in there," he said, his voice low and encouraging. "I know it wasn't easy, but you held your own. You got a sharp mind, Becky. You belong here, and I'm glad you're part of the team." Becky couldn't help but smile, even as a small part of her still doubted if she really did belong. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. Her journey had only just begun, but today, she had taken the first steps into a world she had once thought was out of reach. Becky sat at her desk, her fingers tapping restlessly on the surface as she stared at the screen in front of her. An idea had been building in her mind for weeks, and now it was time to put it into action. Financial clarity, a name that had come to her late one night when she was reading yet another incomprehensible financial document. She had been struck by the thought that so many people, families just like hers, struggled to make sense of the very documents that dictated their financial futures. Her idea was simple but ambitious, an app that would break down the complexities of legal and financial documents into easy-to-understand language. Something that would give low-income families the tools they needed to navigate the world of finance without feeling overwhelmed or lost. But she couldn't do it alone. Becky turned to the team at Whitmore Insurance, some of whom had grown more comfortable with her presence, while others still remained skeptical. She had already proven her worth with her ability to analyze contracts and streamline processes, but this was different. This was her vision, and it was something that could push the company into uncharted territory. She gathered a small group of the company's tech and legal experts, pitching her idea to them. "We have a responsibility," she told them, her voice steady and confident, "to help people, especially those who've been left behind by the systems that we take for granted. Financial clarity isn't just an app. It's a way for us to give back, to democratize financial knowledge." The room was quiet for a moment, the tech team exchanging looks. Finally, one of the developers, Ben, spoke up. "I'm not sure how we can simplify these kinds of documents without losing their legal integrity," he said, skepticism evident in his voice. "These are complex terms for a reason. If we change them too much, we could run into legal problems." Becky nodded, fully aware of the concerns. "I understand, but the goal is not to change the documents themselves. It's to provide a tool that can help people understand what they mean in simple terms. We can create a feature that highlights the key points, explains the terms, and offers examples. If someone is looking at a loan agreement, for instance, they should be able to see exactly what the interest rate means for them, how much they'll pay over time, and what hidden fees they should watch out for." Ben still looked uncertain, but the idea was starting to take root. Becky could see the gears turning in his head as he began to think of ways they could make it work. "I think it's doable," he said after a moment, though his voice still carried a hint of hesitation. "But it's going to take time, and it's going to be a lot of work." Becky smiled, already knowing this wouldn't be easy. "I'm ready for it. Let's get started." Weeks passed, and Becky found herself fully immersed in the development process. She worked closely with the tech team, guiding them through the initial stages of the app's design. It wasn't long before they hit roadblocks. There were challenges with the app's interface, difficulties in programming the document analysis feature, and legal concerns about ensuring that the simplified language wouldn't cause confusion or misinterpretation. The skepticism from some of the higher-ups at Whitmore Insurance didn't help. Carol, the senior executive who had previously questioned Becky's qualifications, was particularly vocal in her doubts. "This app is a risky move," she said during a meeting. "We don't have a track record in the tech space. And what happens if we make a mistake? What if this app ends up doing more harm than good?" Becky met Carol's gaze without flinching. "I understand the risks," she said calmly. "But I also know that this is an opportunity to make a real difference. People are drowning in legal jargon. We have the chance to create something that empowers them, gives them clarity, and helps them make informed decisions." David, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. "I agree with Becky. This could be a game changer. Let's give her the support she needs." With David's backing, Becky pushed forward, her determination unshaken. Every evening after her work hours at Whitmore Insurance, she spent time testing the app's features, offering feedback, and fine-tuning the user interface. She even reached out to her old friends from college, many of whom had continued their studies in finance, to get their input on the legal language she was simplifying. Months of hard work culminated in the app's launch. Becky stood in front of the company's executives at the unveiling, her hands clenched tightly at her sides as she watched the first demo. The app's sleek design appeared on the screen, and a voiceover explained the features. It highlighted key terms in a loan agreement, offering easy-to-understand definitions and visualizations. The audience watched in silence as the app guided them through each section, showing exactly how much a user would pay, what terms they should pay attention to, and how to avoid common pitfalls. The room was still for a long moment, and Becky felt her heart race. Had it worked? Were they impressed? Finally, David spoke up. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I think we've just created something that will change the way people interact with financial documents." Becky felt a rush of pride, but she knew this was just the beginning. The app was now live, available for download to the public. She had created something that had the potential to reach people who had been ignored by traditional financial systems, people who were struggling, just like she once had. But even as the app gained traction, with thousands of downloads in its first few weeks, not everyone was convinced. Some of the executives at Whitmore Insurance were still skeptical about Becky's place in the company. Carol's doubts remained, and there were murmurs about Becky's lack of a formal degree. "She's not the typical corporate type," one of the executives said during a meeting. "How long will this really last?" Becky heard the whispers, but she refused to let them shake her confidence. She had done more than just prove herself. She had created something that made a tangible difference. The success of Financial Clarity was undeniable, and it was something she had built from the ground up, self-taught, relentless, and unapologetically determined. With every success, her confidence grew, and as her role at Whitmore Insurance expanded, so did her influence. The company's executives had no choice but to acknowledge her contributions, and soon, Becky was leading new initiatives, each one pushing the boundaries of what she had once thought was possible. The road ahead wasn't easy, but Becky had come too far to back down now. Financial Clarity was just the beginning. Becky sat in the sleek, glass-walled conference room, her hands clasped in front of her as she listened intently to David's words. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished table where the top executives of Whitmore Insurance sat. Today was different. Today, the conversation wasn't about her latest project or the success of Financial Clarity. Today, David was offering her something that, until recently, had felt unreachable. "Becky," David began, his voice steady and filled with admiration, "you've gone above and beyond. The work you've done has not only improved our internal processes, but has created real change in the way we engage with underserved communities. Your vision for Financial Clarity has resonated with people we never even thought to reach. You've proven that you're capable of so much more than anyone expected." Becky's heart raced. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some curious, some skeptical, but all of them waiting for her to respond. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, but it felt surreal to hear David, her mentor, the CEO of the company, speak of her achievements with such respect. "I've been thinking a lot about how we can continue to grow," David continued, leaning forward slightly. "And I believe that your leadership could take this company to new heights. I want to offer you a formal leadership role here at Whitmore Insurance. You'd be in charge of overseeing innovation and outreach projects, and we'd offer you a full salary with benefits." Becky's mind raced as the words sank in. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. A leadership role, stability, the kind of recognition she hadn't even dared to imagine for herself. But as she absorbed the weight of David's words, a part of her hesitated. She wasn't someone who had simply walked into success. She had fought for every inch, clawed her way up from the bottom. She wasn't about to let anyone think she had been handed this position because of charity or pity. "I appreciate the offer, David," she said slowly, her voice clear and unwavering. "But I need you to know that I won't accept this role unless I've earned it. I'm not here to be a token or a charity case. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I'll continue to work even harder." David smiled, nodding as if he had expected nothing less. "I respect that, Becky, and I want you to know you've earned every bit of this. Your contributions have already proven your worth. This isn't just an offer out of kindness. It's recognition of what you've already accomplished." Becky sat back in her chair, the weight of the decision still settling in her chest. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized this was her moment. She had built her place here, step by step, through sweat, persistence, and an unwavering belief in her own potential. Now it was time to step into the role she had earned. "I accept," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do everything I can to help this company grow." As the meeting wrapped up, Becky felt a wave of determination wash over her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more people who doubted her because of her lack of formal education. But none of that mattered now. She had already proven that her lived experiences and self-taught knowledge had value. It wasn't a degree that made her capable. It was her resilience, her drive, and her vision. Over the next few weeks, Becky settled into her new role with a focus and clarity she had never known before. She began to lead new initiatives, each one pushing the boundaries of what Whitmore Insurance could achieve. She worked on expanding financial clarity, strategizing how the app could reach even more people. She collaborated with other departments, integrating innovation into every facet of the company. There were still whispers behind her back, doubts about whether she truly belonged in a leadership position. But with each project, with every success, those whispers grew quieter. Becky continued to prove that her place at the table wasn't an accident. It was earned every step of the way. As she stood in front of her team one afternoon, presenting a new proposal for expanding their outreach, she looked around the room at the faces of the executives who had once doubted her. Now, they were listening to her, fully engaged, some even taking notes. This was her moment, and she knew, deep down, that she was just getting started. Becky stood by the window in her office, staring out at the sprawling city below. The view from the 24th floor was breathtaking, but it was the reflection in the glass that held her attention. She didn't recognize the woman who stared back at her. She wasn't the same person who had walked into Whitmore Insurance years ago. Shy, uncertain, a single mother juggling multiple jobs. No, this woman had confidence in her eyes, strength in her posture, and a sense of purpose that was unmistakable. She had come a long way, farther than she had ever dreamed possible. Once, she had been stuck in a cycle of exhaustion and struggle, but now, she was one of the key players at a company that had embraced her vision and her leadership. It hadn't been easy. She had faced doubts, challenges, and moments when she wasn't sure if she belonged. But now, standing in the heart of Whitmore Insurance, she saw the fruits of her labor in the company culture she had helped build. A culture of inclusivity, empowerment, and unwavering support for people who had often been overlooked. Becky had always known that her journey was about more than just herself. It was about creating a path for others to follow. She thought back to the days when she had barely managed to make ends meet, when the future felt so uncertain. She thought about her children and how, with every step she took forward, she was creating a future where they could dream bigger. But it wasn't just her family she was working for. It was everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Everyone who had been underestimated. Through her leadership at Whitmore Insurance, Becky had championed initiatives that prioritized digital literacy and financial education for underserved communities. She worked with local organizations, schools, and grassroots movements to ensure that people had access to the tools they needed to navigate financial documents, understand contracts, and make informed decisions about their financial futures. Her app, Financial Clarity, had become a lifeline for so many people who had once felt shut out of the world of finance. It wasn't just an app. It was a bridge to knowledge, empowerment, and opportunity. The success of Financial Clarity had exceeded even her expectations. It had helped thousands of people, and it was continuing to grow, reaching new communities, helping people break through the barriers that had once held them back. The stories Becky heard from users were heartwarming. Stories of families who had finally understood their mortgage agreements, of small business owners who had been able to get fair loans, of individuals who had been able to navigate legal documents with confidence. Becky's story had become a beacon of hope for so many. It wasn't just about financial literacy. It was about breaking down the walls that kept people from reaching their potential. She had become a symbol of what was possible when you didn't let the world's expectations define you. And she wasn't done yet. Today, at a company-wide event to celebrate the launch of their latest initiative, Becky was asked to speak. As she stood before the crowd of colleagues and partners, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves in her chest. But this time, it wasn't fear, it was excitement. She wasn't just a woman who had clawed her way into success. She was a leader, a trailblazer, someone who had created change, and who would continue to push for more. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady and strong. "When I first started here, I never imagined I would be standing in front of you today. I never imagined that a single mother who had dropped out of college to make ends meet would one day be leading initiatives that change lives. But I stand here today not because of luck or some stroke of fate, but because of perseverance, because of hard work, because I refuse to let anyone tell me what I could or couldn't do." She paused for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces before her. We all have the ability to break through the barriers that others try to impose on us. Whether those barriers are financial, social, or even personal, we all have the strength to rise above them. And the moment we start believing in ourselves, that's when the real change happens. Becky's voice grew more powerful as she spoke, her words filled with passion. "I've seen what happens when people are given the tools to succeed. I've seen families who were once struggling, now thriving. I've seen businesses that couldn't get off the ground, now flourishing. And it's not just because of the tools we provide, it's because we're empowering people. We're showing them that they matter, that they have a voice, and that they deserve a chance." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This isn't just about building a career. It's about building a legacy that will inspire future generations to break through their own barriers. And I'm proud to be a part of that. As she finished her speech, the room erupted into applause. Becky felt the weight of her journey lift from her shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just a career. It was a mission to change the world, one person at a time. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.